Welcome to our second panel. The panel is titled Reconstructed, Memories and Spaces. The first intervention will be, it's Imagining Futures Through UN Archived Pasts by Elena Isaev, Department of Classics and Ancient History, University of Exeter, and Peter Campbell, Archaeology Department, British School at Rome. Our second intervention will be Angela Boskovic and Omar Mohammed from Mosul I, Mosul Cultural Recovery and Reclaiming a Cosmopolitan Identity. I would like to mention that Ricardo Bocco will not have an intervention. His intervention will be tomorrow after the movie screening. So participants in this panel will have each 25 minutes instead of 20. Good news. So please, Elena and Peter.
Thank you, Robert. Yes. Well, thank you all very much for being here today. Thank you for the invitation to speak. Lana and I very much appreciate being here. Just a quick correction, it's unarchived pasts. There's no relation to the UN, no UN involvement. Unarchived pasts. So we're going to be talking about a project that we're kind of starting off. And we are archaeologists and ancient historians, so we come from a deep past perspective. And we're trying to critically examine current memory institutions and kind of how we can create new ones in the future. So we'd very much appreciate your feedback and your thoughts and how we can better preserve cultural memory. So let's start with a quick story. It's about a non-traditional archive in a non-place. It was conceived of by somebody who had a grim outlook of humanity and who imagined a better future. Nikolai Vavilov was a botanist in the Soviet Union, and he led expeditions throughout the world to collect seeds from local communities. And his idea was that these could be redistributed in the event of a famine. They were meant to be returned to the local communities, not redistributed elsewhere to other communities. He saw this as a mission for all humanity and an archive that could play an active role in the future. The Leningrad seed bank contained over 250,000 samples, but it wasn't evacuated during World War II. And during the siege, the bank was diligently protected by scientists for the entire duration of the siege. 12 died protecting the seed bank, even though they are surrounded by lentils and wheat. They starved to death. Vavilov's work led directly to the Global Seed Vault, which is currently located in Svalbard. Now, this is one model of archiving the local through global custodianship.
Sorry, my eyesight is not as good as it used to be. So where is Svalbard? Svalbard is about 10 degrees south of the North Pole. And the reason it's in Svalbard is this thing that you mentioned already in the last panel, which is a different kind of value to the land. A land not as territory, but as something that has the nature of the land is what is important there. But perhaps also territory, and we'll come back to that at the end. So it is in Svalbard that the climate change is felt first, if you like. That is where the alarm bells are sounded. A couple of years ago when I was there, the Arctic fjord is Arctic no longer because it did not freeze over the winter. And the waters that are melting there are affecting the shores of India and other places further south. You will probably also know very well here, because the position of that seed bank is directly connected to this region, because Syria was the very first country to access its own seeds because of the drought in 2015. So why was Svalbard chosen? So we come back to the value of the land. Partly because of the environment. So the environment itself allowed for the permafrost to protect the seed bank, which actually the climate change is happening so quickly that they're worried about the destabilizing effect. So even if all electricity was gone, you would still have the seed bank functioning, but that is now becoming problematic. But beyond this, the actual vault that's there, there is a community that's there. Partly that community is there because of the poetry. The people who choose to come there because of an image, a romantic way of being at the edge of the world, whatever that means, an around world. But also because it is a land that anybody could be a guest at, or nobody. It is not a nation state, and technically it does not belong to a nation state, although Norway is its protectorate. But there's even a law that kind of says nobody is allowed to be born there or to die there, because if you're born there, you are stateless, and if you die there, you want to be dying at home. So pregnant women are literally flown off the island, as are sick people. But of course, people are born there, and people do die there. So the reality and the myth connect. And this is the kind of thing that makes me really interested, because Svalbard, am I pressing something? Sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay. Right. This is the problem we had yesterday, I think. So for me, this is interesting because the people who come there literally choose to be there. They are not there because of ethnicity or any national identity. If anything, they come there because of the opposite. So it's a non-nation state context, and it's these kind of contexts that I try to think into, particularly into the ancient world. So the place there is very much a relational place, a place of intersections, if you'd like, rather than of territory. So Desserteau, Dori Massey, Tim Ingold, and many others, who many of you, I think, geographers in the audience who I had the pleasure of talking to yesterday will know much better than I do. Imagine these relational places not as sites where space is what defines your place of being there. That is not to negate the spatialities that the last panel talked about, but rather is to expose all these things as intersections. And this notion of intersection will play through some of the things I'm going to be saying in a moment. So the people that intersect there are climatologists, explorers, scientists, and also, yes, the empires and the economies that are very keen to get, if you'd like, some kind of step there, because the water is melting, the ice is melting so fast that the Northern Passage, they think wouldn't have happened for another 50 years, might actually happen in the next decade. And all of a sudden, Russia and others will be able to sail from the north. Okay, so the meaning of that land is differently conceived, but under the threat of being conceived more in an absolute kind of space. And this takes me back to now 2,000 years ago. Why 2,000 years ago? Well, because this is a world which had no nation states. We have city-states, there's something different. But even the city-states, the land and the territory meant something else completely. One of the kind of shocks both to me and the people I talked to when I started doing this research, partly about different spatial perceptions of 2,000 years ago. So how do you imagine a world, how do you experience a world around you that doesn't have these physical borders? One of the things that I found out is even where we have walls, right up to the late antique period, say around 4th century AD, so that's 1,600 years ago, we have very little evidence of civilians being vetted at fortification gates. What is vetted are goods, things that you can tax, but not people. So the problem wasn't physically somebody being somewhere, but in terms of status. That was the problem. The two did not overlap, territory and citizenship, the way they do today. Roman citizens existed both in Rome, throughout Italy, and in pockets of what became the empire, and eventually the whole empire. So the territory, citizenship, and belonging had a very different relationship in the world that I spent a lot of my time in. And the other thing is there are no regional maps to scale, which again comes quite as a shock. Yes, there were some maps of planning out territories for colonies, for example, if they were new, and veteran settlements. But we don't have regional maps. Instead, what we have are images like this, which are the most kind of cartographic elements that we get at this time. And that's not because the technology was not there. By 4th century BC, that's 2,400 years ago, they could pretty much get the radius of the Earth, almost exactly. So it's not the technology, that technology was not applied to territorializing the world for the purpose of politics or other kind of social ways. So what we have are imaginings of the world in very dynamic ways. They were about stories and they were at eye level rather than top down. And that is what this Nile mosaic is. This is a mosaic of the Nile, which is actually near Rome in a place called Praeneste. You can go see it, it's huge. It's about the size of this screen. It's absolutely stunning. It's about movement and about imagining yourself into these stories. So this notion around, if you don't have a place that is cordoned, right? So the cordon wasn't interesting. Lines were interesting, but not cordons. So what happens if you're trying to give land meaning beyond the kind of meaning I've been talking about? If you want to say that this soil here means something to me as an individual who comes from Rome. If you are Roman, what does this soil mean to you? And we actually have an example of this. Let me see. Oh, you stay there for a second. From a historian called Livy. He lived 2,000 years ago at a moment of empire. Augustus was reconstructing Rome, not very different than the tour we had of Beirut the other day with Ali. Fantastic kind of different imaginings coming together in the site. A site as an archive, and some of the things that were said in the last panel rang very true. But we have this other moment. Livy imagines, at a moment of empire, he goes back 400 years before his own time, and to give meaning to that moment, he says, let's imagine ourselves as those refugees returning to Rome after the Gallic sack. So these Romans, this is the image he does. Romans are coming back in about 397 BC or so. And what they find are the ruins. And then there's a debate. What do we do with these ruins? Do we rebuild, or do we move upriver in an excellent city that is still standing and not destroyed, a city we captured 10 years previously, and just live there? So there's this debate, and he puts into the mouth of a general Camillus, who had been exiled before, the reasons why you cannot move, why this land here, this bit of Rome here is meaningful. Now, as I say, he's functioning at a time when citizenship goes across the whole of Italy and across the whole of empire, so it's bizarre. He does not have the frameworks of nationhood to make that argument. So what frameworks does he depend on? The other thing, as actually just a small note, as a backdrop, Rome sells itself as open city. We are the welcoming place. We are inclusive. We have the refugee Aeneas who's come from Troy, and we have given him place here. We've given him asylum. That term is actually used. Okay, so what frameworks he's got are notions of the idea of home. Can he project the idea of everyone's individual home onto the city? Can he say that the rituals that are important for you as a family are specifically in this soil? The biggest argument he has is that of jurisdiction. The jurisdiction, there is a virtual cordon which said that all assemblies that were civic assemblies took place inside and the military ones outside. The people were buried outside. And that is the only real boundary, if you'd like, that has a space, has a physical prominence in this whole speech. He does not use it to say anything else about the physical territory of Rome, as if you could cut it out from a map. He also says that, we have won Rome back, so it is now a symbol of victory. To give it up now would be equal to defeat. He talks about the fact that it would be an exiled Rome. Can Romans exist anywhere, or do they have to be here? And he himself, by the way, was not from Rome. He was actually from the north of Italy that had only got citizenship in his own lifetime. So the things that are hidden in this kind of text are there's no speech of the people who wanted to move. We only have the speech of the people who wanted to stay. And that is very political. And that's where we're starting to get into the notion of whose voices and in what archives. So the people who wanted to move were the plebeians. They were the ones that were the lower classes, so to speak. Although that's now debated. But in either case, it's those people who, when you wanted to internally displace someone, the colonists, the veterans, you wanted to get them out. A lot of the language that we find today about flushing out, draining, are still used in this context as well. They are the ones that want to move. They want to move because they're not too bothered. They don't have the same connection to Rome. At the same time, the elite and the patricians are positioned as the protectors of the city. So there, the archival voices are starting to compete with each other. So I'm going to talk a little bit about custodianship, linked to Greek tragedy, and then I will hand over back to Peter. So how does this all connect to custodianship? And back to what I was saying before about relational place. So if a site is not a territorial space, really, but an intersection where cultures kind of hover and remain much longer than individuals who pass through them, of whatever ethnicity or background they are, then people coming there are, in effect, reproducing those cultures simply by choosing to live there. They become, if you'd like, the practitioners of that place. And in that sense, through practicing that place, through their life there, they become its custodians. But an open, dynamic custodianship that is possible, where you don't have the gatekeepers, or if you'd like, those who want to ensure that something stays a very specific way and a snapshot is frozen in time. So this notion about open, dynamic custodianship, I want to give you the example of Greek tragedy. Oh, I didn't give you, you know what? I forgot to put this on. This is a fantastic quote. Sorry, just 2 seconds for this. At the end of that speech, what happens? Well, we all know Rome stayed where it was, whatever that means, until it got moved to so-called Constantinople by the ancients. But what Livy tells us is it wasn't the speech that convinced people to stay, but an omen. And then he talks about its reconstruction. And I thought, walking through Beirut yesterday, these words rang in my head. Yeah. So what kind of reconstruction? What does the city look like after? Who's imagining it? And he's talking about this at exactly the time that Augustus is doing pretty much what was happening to Beirut. So big streets, wiping out whole neighborhoods, putting up monumental imperial structures. So, so the city looked more like an occupation at that point than something that was planned. Okay, so tragedy. How does tragedy help us think about open dynamic custodianship? Greek tragedy, and it might seem like a European example, but I hope I will convince you otherwise. Greek tragedy, there are no gatekeepers to Greek tragedy. Anybody can perform and choose to perform a Greek tragedy in any way they want. They can adapt it in any way they want, and nobody will say, I'm not sure if that's still Greek tragedy. And also, the people who do perform it are not just the Greeks, or not just the Europeans. People perform it everywhere. This is a performance of The Suppliant Women by Aeschylus. And just to give you a sense of the power of some of the words, the wonderful thing about this play is that it fully recognizes that people who are fleeing are forced to look like victims at the same time that they have an incredibly powerful voice. So it accepts the agency, it accepts the power of those people, but at the same time recognizes that they have to act as if they are victims. And that is an incredibly powerful fact that I think a lot of contemporary contexts do not know or accept. So in this one, you might also, this is the old one. Oh, sorry, we're just realizing this is the old slideshow, but that's okay. Okay, I'll take 2 more minutes. So, and also Antigone of Shatila. So here's another act of open dynamic custodianship. In Shatila, this was felt to be important. And I'm just gonna end with these words from one of the people who was performing this play, who said, "We should not be broken by displacement, poverty, and life in the camps. We should continue to defend our right to live and dream."
So that brings us to, that's kind of our historical perspective on memory, and what we'd like to do is revisit memory institutions with our current project and find out, are the current memory institutions serving us as best they can? Now, these are institutions like galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. Are they serving the majority of the people? Well, in reality, many of them were formed top-down and reflect colonial power structures. So is it possible to separate the past and present power inequalities from these repositories? Our short conclusion, in short, is no, not without decolonizing these spaces through action. So our current project is trying to reimagine Vavilov and kind of engage different communities, because many of those with the darkest imaginations produce the safest futures. So is there a way to create archives that better serve local communities, either through local custodianship, through a global approach similar to Vavilov, or through open dynamic custodianship, such as with the Greek tragedies, or other models as well? And so how can we create new memory institutions? So what we're trying to do with our project is activate contemporary archives, use them against the grain in new ways to give action and voice to people that have traditionally been disenfranchised from them. In order to do this, what we have to do is address a number of issues with these contemporary archives. That is, address who created it and why, who has access to it, and who's using the material currently. We have to be critical of the power inequalities that each of these archives represents. Now, through understanding the work with contemporary archives, we're then going to look towards the future and how can we create future archives. So there's been a number of examples of people imagining futures. Vavilov is one of them, but there's also another moment during the French Revolution. And what we find is a lot of these archives are created within moments of crisis, moments of revolution. And always the archives and memory institutions fit within the context in which they were created. So during the French Revolution, the revolutionary government founded the Louvre, the famous museum. The king was still in place, even though the revolution had some excess when the Louvre was founded, but there's a great deal of uncertainty. It was only at the end of the revolution in which his head was cut off. So in 1796, in the midst of this revolution, and with the founding of the Louvre, painter Hubert Robert painted the Louvre in the future, imagining what it would look like, what people would have access to, what it would represent to people in the future, looking back at the past, which was his present. Now, that's not to say the Louvre isn't problematic. It is an example of a colonial institution. Instead, it's just meant to look at what Robert imagined as a possible future based on his present circumstances. So the future of memory institutions lies within imagining potential futures. However, contemporary archives are problematic, as we've discussed. How can we activate these archives in a sensitive and ethical manner? It's necessary to examine the creation and use of these and determine whether we can use these as a jumping-off point to create the future archives, in the strain of Vavilov. These archives were created under unequal systems of power, but using them against the grain will hopefully benefit those who traditionally do not have access to them. For example, the British School at Rome has an archive of 50,000 photos from the Monuments Men. This was a task force set up during and after World War II to assess war damage at cultural sites across Europe and North Africa. So here are a couple examples of war damage photos from Italy during World War II, and next to them are contemporary images from Syria. The Monuments Men photos were created mostly by British and American men and meant for a certain group. The choices they made were deliberate, and what they chose not to include is, in many ways, more important or as important as what they did. And these are all things that need to be considered when using an archive such as this. Now, looking at all these photos, different people will engage with them in different ways. Some people may see this as a loss of history, disconnected from the people who inhabit these locations. Others will see these as aftermaths of American military interventions in the regions. Each person's experience informs the use of the archive. With enough people critically engaging with the archive, we can start to have a meaningful conversation about what these archives represent and their potential for the future. One of the examples of this is the recent use of the British colonial archives by the Mau Mau in Kenya. They were a group that was attacked relentlessly for a number of years and perceived as a revolutionary group, when in reality they were just an indigenous minority. It was only through the archives that they were validated, that being another issue of post-colonialism, that these groups need validation from a secondary source. That they didn't have, people weren't listening to their voices. However, repurposing archives requires decolonization. So contemporary archives are a product of these power systems. Who decides what is heritage? Who decides what's saved? Who are the custodians? Who are making these choices? Without acknowledging these reinforces the existing power structures. So in these archives, who is it creating voices for and who's being silenced? Europeans cannot fully disentangle the colonial ties within European archives. It takes people from a variety of backgrounds to do so. In the case of the British School Archive, in the case of the Monuments Men Archive, my colleague Martina Caruso is examining women in the photos and the role of women's photography in that period. And it provides a critical examination of post-war photography in archives, in which the male gaze, and especially visual material, are so prominent. Decolonization is an action, and it has to unsettle everybody. It's a process that disrupts. It can't be a buzzword or a synonym for adding diversity or inclusion. There has to be action there. It has to remove power from those that have traditionally held it and give power to those who have been traditionally disenfranchised. Moving beyond the existing archives, we get to the question, what will future archives look like? And this is the goal of the project is really to get to this stage. The decolonizing action here is the physical creation of archives by local communities. Now, Vavilov imagined a non-traditional archive with global custodianship that served local communities. Is this a model that can also be applied for culture? Or do we need something more like open dynamic custodianship or more egalitarian methods? Who has access and how is that determined? There are certain communities that don't want their information available to others. So how do we build long-term sustainable options between different communities and have them communicating on what works and what doesn't work? We've seen the issues of the gaze and the visual archives. Are non-text and non-photographic archives possible? Would people in the future be more interested in soundscapes or language than in visual mediums? So what alternative approaches are there to the design of archives? Surely they don't all have to be rows and rows of shelves in the basements of these institutions. Are there technological solutions like blockchain, which is a distributed network? Is there an option of bioarchiving, where you store information in DNA, in the inactive part of DNA? Could you repurpose technology to serve as protected archives? Perhaps you could send information and store it on the Mars rover that's now disabled and inactive. Could you move into non-traditional spaces or non-places similar to Svalbard, which the moon serves, it's not owned by any nation? Or is entry into space in these two ways more colonialization?
That very last point, we would not have been saying had we not been here in Beirut, because we've already realized how much decolonize we have to ourselves. And it was thanks to a meeting with Hawaii and her team that we have all of a sudden realized that that in itself can be also a colonizing act. So we thank Najmi for that. But I'd also like to say that, so the past is clearly powerful. It doesn't matter if it's real or imagined, it is clearly powerful. What the archiving does is almost provide evidence or a truth. It pretends to be a truth for a certain kind of imagination. But what we're trying to do about the future archives, and the grounded bit of this is we're just putting together a project, which we very much hope with the Urban Lab here, as well as in, other labs in Tanzania and in Ghana and also in the UK, to try and see if we can create these imagined futures. And we're hoping if we get the funds, you will be here, the first lab that will take us into that future to begin with, which would be incredibly exciting, because everything we've learned even in these 3 days shows this is the absolutely perfect place. It is this kind of intersection where you can have this kind of open, dynamic custodianship. And I'm just going to end with something that came out of the last panel. I think it was Zaha that was quoted about her dreams. And what the Imagining Futures project, I think, has to do is precisely engage and speak and work with and think with people like Zaha. Not simply because you want her voice. That's not, we don't mean appropriation. What we mean is her powerful statement that her dreams have become smaller. Her imaginings of the future are being constrained. And I think it's not simply her past and her story from the past, but precisely that story into the future that needs to be heard. And I think we'll stop there.
Bella and Omar, please.
I would like to thank Huwaida for inviting us to AUB. This is my first visit to Beirut. I believe that although with the very short time I've seen Beirut, but I have many comments on the city. I'm not sure you will like it, so I will keep it to myself. Although I come from, as you see, a destroyed city, but still we have to always defend and protect the heritage and trying to preserve it. I am Omar Mohammed. I am a historian by training. I lived in Mosul under the rule of the so-called Islamic State. I've been reporting from inside the city on the destruction of the city and the social change and how fast it was. I have noticed that Mosul have witnessed the very fast and the quick social change. A city was inhabited by different groups, Christian, Muslims, Yazidis, and other population. And all of a sudden the city became, with ISIS concept of globalism, a city of global population when Asians, Russians, Europeans and Arabs from Arab countries came to the city to join the Islamic State, and the city was populated by them. More than 60,000 were living in the city. The city was divided by ISIS. The Asians were living more in the industrial areas as they were working in the manufacturing weapons for ISIS. Most of the Europeans lived in the well organized cities as they worked for ISIS for banking, etc., and media. Arabs were living in southern neighborhoods of the city. Angel will explain more on the structure of the city. And after ISIS was defeated in the city, most of the city was destroyed, especially what's called or known as the historical part of Mosul, where the city of Mosul was established, have been destroyed. And the city again was, or the population of the city again were deported from the city. And we have seen that a city was turned into a camp, actually, an internally displaced people living in and around the city. But there was a response by the population trying to preserve what was lost and what remained in the city. So many initiatives were launched in the city by young people, especially the youth movement, but also by historians, archaeologists, urbanists trying to preserve and to reclaim the cosmopolitan identity of Mosul. And that it was a center called Mashki Gate. Mashki Gate is one of the Assyrian gates, and it's funny that the founders of the center, they all have the first letter of their names, J. So Professor Jazil Jomart, he is a historian. Jabir Khalil, archaeologist. Jawad Abid, archaeologist and physician. Ahmed Qasim Jum'a is also archaeologist. And all of them are old people, lived in the city trying to reclaim what they call the cosmopolitan identity. They are focusing on the identity of Mosul before the First World War, when Britain forced the city of Mosul to join the nowadays called the modern state of Iraq, and how this new map changed the whole architecture, the urbanism of the city of Mosul. In this context, the city is still living in, as you may see in this situation. This is only one part of the destruction. The deeper you go inside the city, the more the destruction you see. But the people have also responded, especially to preserve what they historically got categorized is ancient history and then modern history, Ottoman history, trying to preserve what they have lost. Families who lived in the city tried to start by building their own mosques, so because they believed the mosque could bring back the people, and which happened. Especially the Ottoman mosque of Mosul called Al-Pasha was built by Al-Jalili family, which ruled the city of Mosul for more than 2 centuries. Once they started rebuilding the mosque and the khans, the markets, people have responded quickly and returned back to the city. But around the city, the situation is still different, because where the camps were established, now we also have a different concept of the camps. It's not the camps of the internally displaced people, but the deported people. They are known as the families of ISIS. More than 50,000 people living, mainly children and women, living in isolated camps. And these camps have become a new financial source for the tribes around these camps and also by the militias. They are trying to tribalize the business of these camps by convincing the international organizations that they can protect the camps, they can provide them with all what they can on one condition: everything should come through the tribes. And this is how the situation is creating a new concept of the camps, of what we understand of camps. More camps like this are being created in northwest, the city of Mosul, especially on the borders of Syria, where we are receiving Syrian deported people, but they are not called refugees. They are all called, or are being given the concept, ISIS families. And in this way, the international organizations are facing a new stage of a new population trying to open their own space in these areas. I will let Angela explain more on the social initiatives and these camps. Thank you.
Thank you to Hoeda and her entire team here for organizing this event and for being so brave to include us as activists working with Iraq and in Iraq. And in Mosul, we are not a big research institute, so we are presenting what we are working on and what people who are working with us are working on. So we're very grateful that that was respected here today. And as Mosul tries to rebuild, unfortunately, and I will focus a little bit on this point, we had a terrible tragedy in recent days, which probably many people saw on the news. And it, strangely enough, made international news, which usually events in Mosul don't make international news in this way, recent ones. Here is a very interesting place in Mosul for the people there, because it's called the Mosul Tourist Island, or Amara Beyond, which means the mother of two springs. Springs meaning the season, the time of year for the non-Arabic speakers. And the idea is that's because Nineveh as a province has a very long spring, and it's very green, and there's lots of flowers. Agriculture flourishes in this time and used to supply not just all of Iraq, but much of the Middle East with agricultural goods. Unfortunately, that's been extremely disrupted since 2003, and then, of course, since the occupation of ISIS by 2014, the displacement of farmers from their lands to other cities in Iraq and to cities around the world. And so much of that heritage has been lost. However, there's one small nature site left that's part of Mosul, but a small island in the Dijla, in the Tigris River, the Mosul Tourist Island, and it's called Amara Beyond. And on the 21st of March, which is the holiday of Nowruz for some people, the celebration of spring, and also the holiday of mothers. So both the idea of life and renewal and rebirth, mothers and their children and families wanted to go to this place of Amara Beyond for picnics and to use the Ferris wheel and the celebratory activities that they have there. They have a small amusement park for children. They wanted to celebrate with their children in the only safe space there is in Mosul. Iraq lacks cultural spaces, particularly for women and children. It lacks safe spaces in the public space for women and children throughout the country, and in particular in Mosul. So this was the one place that they could go. Unfortunately, on this day, mothers and their children, and some men and some families, brothers and sons and husbands, boarded what we call the Abara. Everybody was calling Abara a ferry, but it's not really a ferry. We call it now a death box, because it was not actually a boat at all. It's something we think resembling used or stolen military equipment, and that served the bottom of what this was called the Abara, or the ferry. This Abara should have had maybe 50 people on it, but instead it was packed. We have the archival video with exactly 287 persons, including children's babies 4 months old in strollers. And they were packed onto this boat, And this boat has 2 cables which connect to the other part of the island. It should have been just a 3 or 4 minute ride across the Tigris River. Instead, when this ferry set off, the cable snapped. The boat literally rocked from one side to the other, took water, and threw all the people into the Tigris River. Most of them couldn't swim, and the videos are just horrifying. It looks as if it's ducks or birds. It almost looks elegant because you think something's floating on the water, except it's horrific because it's people floating to their deaths. Unfortunately, this has been the result. We have at least, I'm not sure on the current count, more than 120 persons confirmed dead. They're finding new persons every day as divers and fishermen go out on their boats. South, now the bodies have flown far out of Mosul, out of the town of Hamam al-Aril, for those who know Mosul, where all the NGOs used to set up their camps. And they are, of course, floating away. The other 2 scenes here, to the scene of the woman, on the 22nd of March, immediately after this terrible attack happened, and it was this terrible event, and it really was an attack on families, and I'll explain why that was in a minute. But the outrage was so great, not just by all people in Mosul and Nineveh, but people around Iraq. Everybody was posting things because it was just mothers and children trying to celebrate a holiday that were devastated. So it was something no one could ignore, and everyone knows why this happened, really. And so immediately the government knew they needed to do something, as Namark discussed in her, when things get very loud, they make appearances, of course, and in the photo, that's the Prime Minister of Iraq visiting a hospital with a woman, a mother who was pulled from the water by a fisherman, and most of the people, unfortunately, did not continue. This was from the 22nd, also image of March, the day after. Many people, just full families, their husbands who lost their wife, small children, everyone fled to this scene, which is the scene of a happy place, became this black place. And everyone went and collected their families. Unfortunately, we know that this incident is not really about a ferry or not really about someone who wanted to put too many people on a boat. It's about the reconstruction of Mosul and of Nineveh, which is completely devastated. Almost all of the towns were occupied by ISIS. Many of them were burned as ISIS fled. Much of Mosul has been destroyed in the battle for ISIS. So the destruction of Mosul and Nineveh is not focused only because that's part of Iraq. Iraq faces destruction in many capacities throughout the country. But Mosul, Nineveh itself is incredibly destroyed. However, there's a huge international reconstruction effort for the city and for the province. Unfortunately, it's not taking the route we would hope, but that is probably quite logical given the conditions. Most of the these are not photos of the war. These are photos of reconstructed roads and bridges. This is just a few days ago. There were 8 bridges over the Tigris River that have since fallen. The roads are falling under the seasonal rains. These are roads and bridges that were recently rebuilt by various UN agencies, by international reconstruction efforts, hundreds of millions of dollars that have flown into Mosul and Nineveh from around the world. We know that the corruption in Iraq is immeasurable and inexplainable. It is a monster that has literally devoured the entire country, and in the reconstruction process, it is the central player. This is one of the last bridges we had over the Tigris. This is a photo, I believe, from 3 days ago. We were still updating our images as we came here. Now we say Mosul doesn't have need ways to cross the Tigris. We have floating bridges. You can take boats to the floating bridges, and it can be like a scenery. It's a new attraction. These were reconstructed bridges that have just floated away because there was no citizen safety protection. There's no government oversight of the reconstruction efforts. There is complete corruption in the obtaining of materials, and no safety standards. I want to show the next 4 photos, and intersect them with what Omar discussed and with what I presented, because it's very important to discuss how these things happen, and I think some of our presenters have already mentioned that and probably will. Reconstruction tends to consolidate effects of war and conflict, and I think that happened here in Beirut and in many other places. So what was already happening to a city will be cemented in the reconstruction period, good or bad. The building on the left is called the Jardak building. This was built in the 1940s in Mosul. It was quite a famous building. It was built by an architect named Toma Jardik with a partner who was Lebanese Armenian, and I'm sorry I forget his name, but he also built buildings here in Beirut. It was a very famous building, and the types of people who had businesses in this building were doctors, magazines, publishers. It was quite famous in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. As Mosul itself was losing this identity, many of these historic spaces kind of became lost. And if you see on the right, this is a kind of shop for sandwiches and quick restaurant shop. His shielding for his restaurant is covering, a third of the building. This is before, of course, ISIS. Now I show 2 photos from the left and the right. The left is the image we have of what the building suffered in the war, in the war to take back Mosul from ISIS. There's damage for sure, but it's somehow still manageable. Perhaps I'm not an architect, but there's manageable damage in the photo on the left. As the reconstruction chaos continues, and there's been almost no attention paid to historic buildings in the city, and as the corruption is so high and virtually anyone can do anything they want, the photo on the right is not from the war. The photo on the right is what their developers are pulling down. The next photo, I take us back to the island. So this is a photo of the Mosul tourist island. This is a photo of the island being reconstructed in 2018 January. So this tourist island where the tragedy happened with the ferry was just reconstructed after the occupation of ISIS and the liberation of the city. So technically, things on this island should have been working well. If things in a normal situation are working well, construction standards would have been applied, licenses would have been held, inspections of the equipment would have been held. Frighteningly enough, this island operates a huge Ferris wheel for children. So imagine if this Ferris wheel fell, how many hundreds of children would have been killed? We have no idea if the equipment was ever inspected, if any of the reconstruction efforts were ever inspected, but you see the result. I bring us back to the points about the reconstruction, the corruption, the tragedies, and then the response. Mosul is full of people, like any city, any place, and they are appalled and they are horrified, and they try to take action, like any people who feel helpless in a situation but try to do something. And these 2 images are social media images by artists, by designers. One is from an artist from Mosul called Hamza Al-Fikri, and another from an artist from Baghdad. Both of these are designs, artistic designs, but they were not made for the gallery. They were made for everyone to use on the social media. And everyone changed, or so many people from Mosul and Nineveh and around Iraq and around the world who were appalled, changed their Facebook profile photos and cover photos to these 2 artistic works. And obviously, you don't need my explanation. They're so sensitive and they're so apt that they show you exactly what was the result there, that mothers and children died. This is another artistic response to that event. It's by an artist from Mosul, very well known, Abdulrazak Amaula. He painted this in exactly 2 hours. It was his artistic response. He also posted this on Facebook, and this was another image that flooded the social media. And I think his pain is evident. The civil society response and the artistic response continues. If you can see the photo to the left, upper left, the poster these young men are holding is the poster of that logo. So they not only put the logo on their Facebooks, they printed it, they brought it around the city, they pasted it on boards. So people were thinking everywhere about this. The other two pictures are also artistic interventions that happened at the site of the incident. And here was a gathering, again, a civil response, an urban response to that tragedy at the University of Mosul. Young people, women and men, students and citizens from the city marched together. They held signs together. They posted live videos on Facebook for everyone around the world to follow. It was a silent march, and everyone was asked to wear black or dark colors. I just want to say another word about, we talked about cities, who controls cities and spaces, civil protection units for Italians, especially very important element. I'm Italian. We grew up with civil protection and have a very, very high respect for civil protection units. Civil protection units exist not at all in Iraq. The civil protection that came, the river police and the fire department, came with no equipment to the scene of the tragedy, cannot swim, and had no rafts or life jackets. The people who saved people from the water and are still pulling bodies from the water are fishermen, people who had very small boats around the river, and divers who come from the southern Iraqi city of Basra to help the fishermen pull out bodies. We should say all these people are citizens. They're not trained in emergency search and rescue response. Again, this is the final photo I will show. It's of young people as the bridges have fallen around the city, and the truck drivers. Iraq is almost completely dependent on imports of everything from food to construction materials to survive and live. The trucks can no longer get around the city because the bridges and roads are collapsing. So they are stranded with their trucks and their loads, and they're afraid to leave them because there are who knows which criminals can take their loads. So young people have organized food drives. They're gathering food to go deliver to the truck drivers. Another artistic response at the College of Law in Mosul about what law really means in Iraq. Please email us. Please send us your postcards and email us.
Again, for those who are not in the room, when we announced it earlier, Professor Ricardo Bocco will present after the movie screening tomorrow. So he's not part of this panel. It was moved because he wants to discuss the movies that are being screened as representations of spaces within Palestinian camps. So his intervention has been moved to the movie screening session. Thank you.
Very interesting. Sites of intersection, whereby in the second section we are dealing with territories of identity, okay, strong identity. So I open the floor, please, for questions.
Good morning. My question is to Elena and Peter. Thanks so much for this beautiful talk. I wanted to ask a few questions. The first is just, can you please take us back to the island, the one you started with, and maybe tie back the discussion to perhaps you ran out of time, but I'd be really interested to see sort of how you tie the project back to that compelling story. The other questions I have, the one has to do with, so how do we deploy the archive into the future for disenfranchised and dispossessed groups, such as the example of the indigenous group you mentioned in East Africa, without without playing into or consolidating identity enclaves, even as we validate their right to participate and practice in the land and in the face of colonial restriction. The third and last thing I want to say, because I'm really excited about this topic, and I do some research on it, so I'd love to speak with you afterwards, on heritage and the role of a critical approach to heritage, basically. So there's an example of a site in eastern England called Orford Ness, which is like a former military base or like a lab for various military experimentation. And I visited it there, and it seems that the policies that the state has towards this place is to just let it be. They don't want to preserve it because it's problematic to renovate, restore a site that is so emblematic of violence, because the military developments that took place there were responsible for destroying the wars in the First World War and the Second World War. And at the same time, they don't want to eradicate it because, of course, we have to grapple with our own past, with the ideas that we grapple with a past history. We don't just erase traces of our own violent intervention. So what is your take on a way of approaching the future archive where you, in terms of material things like buildings, where you just don't do anything with them and you leave them to just be? Yeah.
Well, in regard to Svalbard, is the sound on? Yeah. It's one model that could potentially work, where you have a local archive with global custodianship. But, sorry, hold it closer. Sorry about that. So it's one model that can work, or that may work, depending on what's being saved. So local data or materials with global custodianship. Svalbard is one of those places that's interesting because it was meant to, if everything about the archive fails, the seeds are still preserved. And then that's what you need for long-term preservation, that if, in the event of no electricity or anything else, because of the temperatures and the environment, the seeds will be saved. Now, that may not be true with global warming. So I think Svalbard provides a model to think through archives. However, it's in and of itself, there's a number of issues, obviously, as the climate changes. But it's just one model. And so there's other models. So the dynamic custodianship and also just different ways of creating local archives, working with communities. One of the things that the project would like to do is we have a commissioning phase where different groups, different researchers, different stakeholders can apply for funding in order to enact the archive, to try out new ideas, to try different systems.
Yeah, just to add a bit of that, I mean, you grasped it right in one, is like, why are you starting there? The strange thing is that this archiving, for me, several years ago, started in Svalbard. It was precisely because people could not tell me why no one was allowed to die or be born there. People who live there. You'd think it would be, for us, such an essential thing, but they couldn't. They all had different stories. So that's what made me start thinking about intersections, open dynamic custodianship, and then talking with Peter, who is much more coming from the archiving end. In that way, we were able to kind of think with this together. But also, the reason for me Svalbard is important, as a starting thinking point, really, as an idea. How can we think about diversity and preserving diversity and diverse stories, as well as diversity of some form that isn't constantly based in ethnicity and nationhood? And culture not connected to necessarily ethnic and nationhood stories. So in a way, the open dynamic custodianship means that people can be seen as custodians rather than intruders. So it's not, oh, you can't come here because you don't understand these kind of cultures. You choosing to live somewhere, and choice is itself a political and highly problematic word. I realize that here. But in a way, you are contributing to, so you become its custodian. Yeah. So I think it's a thinking space that we're just starting with. So it's not the end of a project, but I would love to talk to you and anybody else. Hopefully, if we do get this support, even if we don't, we'll find other ways of doing it. Hawaii is very creative about funding and other things, to really try and do something precisely to think into that space. We haven't really answered your point about buildings. Yeah, so what do you do with this? And I think some of the MA students I talked to yesterday were precisely, Len actually, talking about what do you do with these things that are sites of violence sometimes and destruction and bad memories. If by erase, do you erase them, which is maybe what the state wants to do, pretend they're not there? How do you expose them in a way that does something positive rather than negative? So I think that's, again, that story is something you probably know about.
Hi. Also a question to Elena and Peter. Well, what is implied from your presentation that archiving is a part of a political project or related to this political project. Therefore, imagining a future of archiving is also a political act. And anyway, you talked about decolonizing community, but how can we talk about a new political project which is also subject to contestation, conflict without addressing issues such as social class, gender, I don't know, maybe a gender-based archive or other issues?
Another question, please.
Thanks. Yeah, just to, it's basically, it follows the previous question. I'm just interested to know whether, or how rather, how will what I, as a layperson in that kind of like data storage technology, would call like data storage limits, I guess, when it comes to hardware. And as far as I know, like in some 20, 50 years, we will have reached like a storage limit, right? And so how will that affect archiving? And what is like what are the political maybe consequences to that limit of storage? Thanks.
I'm just going to pick up on what you said at the end. I mean, one of the things we're very keen to do, access is something we're very interested in, the politics of access particularly, but also different forms of archiving that are both oral, that are somehow seen as almost archaic in some ways, or recreating something that's folkloric, archaic, and then again is frozen as an oral archive that's now recorded. So your point goes back to that. But we want to also maybe work with communities to think with, for example, in Australia, so things around songlines. I don't know if some of you might be much more familiar than me about songlines, but the fact that the archive is the landscape, and it's through the telling of the story, through that landscape, that you continue it. And that's why mining or any kind of interventions like that, that cross across people's songlines become problematic. So I think it is very much about, and also the whole act of archiving, the obsessive act of archiving at the moment. I mean, there's archiving of the kind that the Mosul's that you are presenting, which is of the moment and has a relevance now, and has about stories now, but challenging them. And then what will happen to these? Is it important that these are preserved, say 200, I mean, this is a question I don't know the answer to at all, or even the ethics of this question. But in 200 and 300 years, is it going to be the archive that's going to be important, or is it going to be enough to have a summary of some kind of smaller thing of what you're doing, and how will that be preserved? And is it about the storytelling? I don't know. I mean, I think that is an incredibly important question that we will have to deal with.
Just to add that there's a big emphasis on digital data these days, but really what's becoming more and more important is having parallel archives. So digital maybe, but also other forms. You have to have physical forms as well. And just from an archaeological background, some materials preserve in the long term and some don't. And so maybe you need to experiment with which things preserve in the long term and create parallel archives.
Okay.
I think Serge was first.
Did I? Okay. Go ahead, Judith. No. Okay. My question is for Omar and Angela, and it's a general question I'm reflecting on. Is first of all, what happened to the civil society, like in Mosul or in Beirut or anywhere? Like, what happened after? There was a massive movement for the funeral, as we saw. All of a sudden, everybody got. First of all, was there no involvement before during the reconstruction, and the corruption that happened and all of that? Was there any kind of civil movement, or the people interested, or will they be interested now? And I'm just thinking, how would you fight corruption, and how would the people that are being either displaced or the what kind of a role should they take into initiating? And because it seems the people, the corrupted, the people with the money are always ready to come to, they're ready. They've already been like quickly taking place, and they've thought about it, that after when the reconstruction comes, they do their thing. As opposed to the displaced, and is there a way to start getting them ready before, anticipating that there will be reconstruction? Thank you.
To be honest, the first to start the reconstruction in the city were the civilians. This was the first response when they started cleaning the streets, not just helping people to return back home, but also helping them to restore their small shops, to help them get financial support. But the corruption happens when you NGOize the social movements, and this is what happened in the city of Mosul. Many social movements were launched in the city by civil activists. Then you face the problem with the international organizations asking you, the only way to fund you is to have the NGO. And when it comes to the NGO should follow the regulations of the government, the local government. And once you follow the regulations of the local government, you become part of this corruption. And then you produce the corruption. So that's why we are trying to protect the social movements, to keep them going as social movements. We don't need NGOs. We don't want to go into this NGOization of, just like what happened in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is, with all due respect, is a country living in NGO business. The city of Mosul is moving into this level. Fighting, the international organizations found themselves that they were funding militias in the city without, they said, we don't know. We believe them, of course. But the money it's not easy to control the money flooding into the city. And we are talking about millions of euros and dollars. In my opinion, the only way is to keep the city running as a city with its social activities, families, people knowing each other, especially in the bazaars. There was amazing initiative in the old bazaar of the city. You have seen the photo of the destruction. In the middle of that destruction, someone decided, as someone was paying respect to the neighbors he lost. He said, I will return back, I will build my house, I will use a nice color. He used the pink color. He said, I want to show the sign of life. And he built the house in the middle of the destruction. Then the people, they saw him doing this, and they then returned back. There was another initiative by the people without being NGO. It's called, they use this small truck called Dumbar to clean the city from the debris. This was amazing until it was NGOized. And now it's more politicalized. It's more like a place where politicians come to take selfies and so on. We are here talking about the culture. We are talking also about the university. Just yesterday, there was a French corner was opened inside the Mosul University. And we appreciate and respect the diversity of the city, and the city is welcoming again the international presence in the city. But this is not just a cultural action, it's also political. I mean, they are unable to present or differentiate between what's political and what is cultural. Everything in the city, and you mentioned the corruption, for example, the militias have, in order to adapt themselves to the international fundings, they have opened something called in Arabic, the al-makatib al-iqtisadiyya, or economical offices, where they control all the projects. When the international organizations working with them, when you ask them why do you work with them, they say they are NGOs, they are organizations. So I don't know if we can even fight the corruption, but we can manage the corruption.
I wanted to thank you for another very interesting panel.
Your turn, please.
Oh, sorry. I've also a question for Omar. When you were talking about the attempt to retrieve cosmopolitan nature of the city, I also read in the abstract that these are intergenerational conversations. I was wondering whether you could say something about the role of nostalgia in these discussions and whether that is perceived or considered to be problematic at all.
Hello. Yes. So I really support the calls from this morning to specialize our understanding of what's going on over there. Yet I have a question about temporality. I thought back of it when I saw the picture shown by Angela about the destruction from the war and the reconstruction through the through the reconstruction efforts.
The destruction of the reconstruction.
Exactly. I think Beirut also has a lot of cases that can also reinforce this point. And I also will slightly tackle this in my presentation about women. The question eventually comes as, how do we conceive the in post-conflict periodizations, and how the dominant really linear conceptions of these periodizations affect our thinking and our also how do we think of possible interventions and solutions. So I invite you. I think also the work about archives can also refer to this this question, and I hope we can also go back to this in the rest of the conference.
Okay, so we'll start.
As the intergeneration conversations happening in the city now, it's also important to say here that there is kind of a conflict between the two generations. It's not just nostalgia to the status of Mosul when it was representing the diversity. Those two generations, especially the elderlies, who are trying to protect the identity of the city, represented by Mashki or Maska Gate Cafe or Cultural Club, is not well perceived and accepted by the young generation, as what happened in the city of Mosul was considered as an invasion by extremist Islamists. So the response of the young and the youth movement in the city is also to prove to the rest of the Iraqis, as the city also witnessed the deportation of the Christian and the genocide against the Yazidis. And to be clear, ISIS was considered in this case a Sunni force, and because the population are also considered as Sunnis, so the response of the youth in the city is becoming more refusing everything related to the old generation, everything related to what's considered Sunni, everything related to what's called Islam, etc. Any kind of these actions. But there is in the middle of all of this conflict, I mean, not also to mention the urban and the rural conflict in the city happening. There was a spot in the middle of the city where they call the Rasif al-Kutub, the side road of books, because the old bookstore of the city was destroyed, so they reopened something, could bring them all together. So you'd find writers coming from around the city, meeting there from rural and urban areas, all of them meeting with books. But the problem also with the nostalgia is we don't know which city they are reclaiming, because the city being reclaimed by the elderlies, by I would say the intelligentsia of the city is the diverse city, the city that always being a productive city. Some people are now more nostalgic to the city under Saddam because they lost the security, they lost the feeling of being safe, the feeling of being in the power. Other people are nostalgic to a city goes even beyond the First World War, the Ottoman city, and more conflict. You have also other people, especially the Assyrians and Nineveh plains. People are more nostalgic to, they are reclaiming the Assyrian Empire. They say we have to reclaim the, so we have different identities in the city now. Conflicts happening in the city. But the good thing about these conflicts is it's producing a new intellectual discourse where the people have finally realized that the only way to survive is to have discussions about architecture, about the urban structure of the city, about how to build a city that can include everyone to produce the future.
Just a quick comment on both of your comments about social movements and reconstruction and being inclusive. We should say that of the hundreds of millions that are pouring into Mosul Nineveh by the UN agencies, by the European Commission, USAID, and other big funders, there have been no conferences to include the public. There have been no kind of civil society dialogues at all. There have been liaisons with certain elements of the government. There are protection elements, the NGOs, as Omar explained, that have already been monopolized for various political and religious parties. And so there have been almost no discussions with youth activists, with civil society leaders, with women, and this kind of thing. So all of this has been marginalized. Only the ferry tragedy, because it was women and children, brought this issue of public safety and safe spaces for women and children back into the reconstruction discussion.
Also, just to note something here is, after this ferry tragedy, the people were protesting against the government. The government representatives, they came also to protest against the government. I mean, this is how things are going on in the city. The social activities or the social activists are becoming stronger. They are trying to adapt themselves to the social media platforms. They have managed to change the governor of the city. They have managed to change some of the corrupted people in the city. But it's returning. The corruption is more powerful than what we think in the city. And I'm afraid, and I've always called for this in the city, like, stop rebuilding the city, because you are destroying the city again. This is not a reconstruction. A reconstruction is not based on fundamental understanding of the city. Is another way of destruction, because it's going to produce more conflicts in the city in the future.
Thank you. Sort of following on from that, how is the reconstruction of downtown Beirut viewed elsewhere in the region as a kind of blueprint for rebuilding of a devastated city?
My question is for maybe for you, but it's based on what Omar said. It was so interesting that you said that people started to come back to Mosul after the mosques mainly and the markets were rebuilt, and this really reflects maybe the real power structures in the city, which are the religious men or so I was thinking about how we can incorporate these actors with any attempts to rebuild, to reconstruct, and how much work is done in that perspective. The other question is related to the IDPs camps and whether you think it will reach an end or people will be able to restabilize in their original cities while there are beneficiaries that are getting benefits of their persistent problem, and how we can fight that.
Yeah, is this on? Thank you, great panel. I wanted to kind of ask a question that kind of builds on Omar's response to the earlier question about the kind of conflicts over an understanding of the past in the city and whose narrative about the past should prevail. Because it seems to me that opens an invitation to Elena and Peter to talk about the value of the archive of the future, because it's so hard to come to some consensus about the past or even the present. So I think it's a very powerful, I mean, there's a lot of power in this panel today to think about the archive of the future. So my question then to Peter and Elena is, how do you distinguish a vision of the future from an archive of the future? And also, so maybe you can tell us a little more about how in your work, your historical work, even about the distinction between citizenship and custodianship, which I really like a lot, and I'd like to hear more about that, whether you have any examples from history of a moment in which a vision of the future allowed an overcoming of the history of the past. Because I think that and I don't know the Roman citizenship across territory before nation states. I don't know that period that well. But I think that question about citizenship versus custodianship is different in a conflict situation than in kind of an imperial situation where you have a kind of an order that's accepted because there's differences in different sites on the territory. That everyone does their own thing and they're all working in this large, imperial network. I guess I'm just trying to say, how can we take what your presentation and apply it to Mosul?
3 minutes. We have still 3 minutes.
A lot of questions that were asked are just fantastic questions and make us realize how much work we will have to do. And I realized we didn't actually address another question about archiving as political, which is also incredibly important. My first answer, which is a bit of a cop-out, would be is precisely to have these conversations with Angela and Omar and everyone else and to see, well, what can we do? Can I think of historical examples? It's difficult for us to think about historical examples because there are lots of imaginings of futures that are very mythologized, right? So then how are those then brought down into what actually happens? But I think you're all kind of hitting the point, and it was very interesting in your last answer as well, is especially about the youth. About my own work, how I've tried to integrate this into contemporary society was me and another team in a project called Deplacing Future Memory, which is again different, was asked to come into a site of conflict in Swansea, out of all places, because this was in 2008 when there were refugees moving in, there were conflicts there, about how do you just kind of not draw a line by ignoring things, but get people to focus not so much even on shared pasts, but more about what do we share now, and using kind of ancient history, but also abstract art to think into a different kind of future. So that doesn't quite answer your question, but there are examples of how that can be done, employing the past not because past imaginings of the future, but because it allows alternatives for different thinking. That you can have allegiance, you can have belonging, you can have commitment to culture without it always being sectarian, nation state, or something else, or whatever the politics is employing. And that, I think, is something we have to be very careful about. So by using past archives, it's not about then recreating these kind of divisions. Yeah, it's exactly about your youth who are saying, no, but there's a completely different language. But how do we support that without NGOizing? How do we support that without them coming out from the top?
I mean, the past is, I mean, or the future archives, as it's political, as someone asked here, is it depends on, like, again, on whose narrative it is. And we have seen, as an example for the future and the past, is the American Black history, or the history of slavery, history in Africa, the history of wars in everywhere. Whose past is it? And whose narrative is it? Who is it presenting? And who's also, we also have a problem of definitions. Whose definition it is? Like when we say archives, let's take a look at the British archives. What they are trying, it's also the question of access. What kind of archives will be released? What kind of archives will be hidden? What kind of I also I think some time in the last year they say that there is a huge department of the British Archive were kind of destroyed in somehow, they don't know how. It's also how what control will we have on these archives? For example, in the city of Mosul now we have a potential a huge archive in the city, photographs. We are already working on something called the Virtual Museum of Mosul, where we recreate neighborhoods. These neighborhoods were destroyed, but we are bringing photographs and stories of people who completely vanished from their friends to recreate the neighborhood, trying to protect their future and to give them some kind of archives where people can remember them. But still, it's also a question of the next generations when they will come. The questions they will have will be completely different from the questions we had when we created the archives.
Our time have elapsed, but I will grant the organizer
Thank you.
additional time.
The privilege. I won't take long, but I would like to open this debate even beyond this point, because I'm trying to react to Omar's statement when he said any reconstruction of the city without a fundamental understanding of it is another form of destruction. Although I agree with you to a great degree, I think we have to be very critical of this kind of fundamental, understanding. Then you kind of commented at the end that it's about authorship. If we have a singular authorship of inscribing a particular past or a particular future, then we are trapped. I think all histories are critical and social or political edits. The past is always edited for political reasons. The future is always narrated for political reasons. But if we allow a more collective debate in sharing into that future, I think we lower the risks of destroying the past. And I really think it's about the singular authorship, which is problematic. So I just want to open up this idea that a more participatory approach to constructing the past as well as the future, however we imagine it, should be one that we entertain as practitioners and theoreticians to allow for more people to take ownership and have an inclusive understanding rather than a fundamental one. So I'm just trying to open up the provocative statement that you made. Thank you.
We have a lunch break now between 1:30 and 2:30. Okay, we hope to see you back on time. Okay.